Imagine standing in the heart of a Viking settlement, the smell of wood smoke drifting from longhouses, the clatter of tools in a blacksmith's forge, the laughter of children running between rows of livestock pens, and the distant call of traders preparing their ships for journeys that would connect Scandinavia to the farthest corners of the known world. Beyond the image of fierce raiders, the Vikings were farmers, merchants, families, and dreamers whose daily lives built the foundation of a culture that shaped Europe and beyond. Today, we journey into their homes, their markets, and their traditions to discover what life in the Viking world was truly like. Welcome back to our series on the history of the Vikings. If you enjoy exploring the hidden sides of the past, the stories of warriors, explorers, and ordinary people who built extraordinary civilizations, then make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Now, let's step inside the Viking world, not through the eyes of kings or raiders, but through the lives of the men, women, and children who made up the beating heart of Norse society. Life in the Viking settlement. A Viking settlement was more than just a collection of longhouses scattered along a fjord. It was a living organism. Each homestead, each family, and each trade played a role in keeping the community alive. Though the Vikings are remembered for their longships and their raids, the truth is that the majority of their lives were spent in quiet labor, rooted to the soil and sea that sustained them. The longhouse stood at the center of Viking life. Built of timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched or turf roofs, it was not only a home, but a symbol of continuity, a place where generations could live under one roof. Inside, the central hearth glowed constantly, a fire that cooked meals, provided warmth, and offered light through the dark Scandinavian winters. The walls were often lined with benches and storage chests, while animal hides softened the wooden surfaces. Families slept together, ate together, and told stories by firelight, passing down tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. Women played a central role in maintaining this domestic world. Far from being passive figures, Viking women were managers of households, keepers of keys, and custodians of property. A woman in Norse society could inherit land, manage farms, and even divorce her husband if the marriage failed. The keys she wore on her belt were not just practical tools. They were symbols of authority, granting her control over the family's wealth and storerooms. Children grew up learning the skills they would one day need to survive. Boys watched their fathers in the fields, at the forge, or on the shipyard, while girls followed their mothers in cooking, weaving, and managing livestock. Yet play was just as important as work. Children chased wooden toys shaped like ships or animals, carved by their elders, while young boys practiced with small wooden swords, imitating the warriors they idolized. Farming and the land. The foundation of Viking life was farming. Despite the image of restless raiders, most Norsemen were farmers first. The soil of Scandinavia, though often rocky and thin, still yielded crops of barley, rye, and oats. These grains became the staples of their diet, transformed into porridge, bread, and ale. Sheep, cattle, pigs, and goats roamed the pastures, while horses held a special place in Viking culture, both as vital working animals and as sacred creatures tied to religious rituals. Seasonal rhythms dictated everything. Spring meant plowing and sowing. Summer was a time of tending crops and preparing voyages. Autumn brought the harvest, and winter was long and harsh, a season of survival. During those cold months, families gathered indoors, relying on stored food, salted fish, and preserved meats. It was a time of storytelling and craftsmanship, when men carved intricate designs into wood and bone, and women wove elaborate textiles that would clothe their households and provide goods for trade. Fishing was just as essential as farming. The Vikings were expert seafarers, not only in war, but in sustenance. Nets and lines brought in cod, herring, and salmon, while seal and whale hunts provided oil, meat, and hides. In coastal settlements, fishing was often more important than tilling the soil, and families relied heavily on the bounty of the sea, trade, and the wider world. While some Vikings turned to raiding, many others built their fortunes through trade. Norse merchants connected Scandinavia to a vast web of commerce that stretched from the icy shores of the North Atlantic to the warm markets of the Mediterranean and even the distant lands of the East. Furs from the north, walrus, ivory, amber, and iron were exchanged for silver, silk, spices, and glassware. In bustling marketplaces like Hidabi and Burka, foreign merchants mingled with Norse traders, their stalls crowded with goods that told stories of distant worlds. A woman in a Danish village might wear beads from Byzantium, while a farmer's wife in Sweden could drink from a glass cup made in the Islamic Caliphate. Trade routes followed both land and sea. Along the rivers of Eastern Europe, Viking merchants traveled deep into Slavic lands, reaching as far as Kiev and Novgorod, opening the path to the rich markets of Constantinople. To the west, Norse ships crossed the North Sea to Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms, where they exchanged goods and sometimes raided when opportunities arose. This global connection gave the Vikings a worldview that stretched far beyond their fjords and farms. They were at once local farmers and global travelers, their lives rooted in their settlements but connected by the roots of trade and exploration, culture, and community. Viking communities were tight-knit, bound together by kinship, law, and tradition. Disputes were settled not in isolation, but at the Thing, the Viking assembly, where free men gathered to debate, argue, and pass judgment. Here, law was spoken aloud, remembered, and recited rather than written, and the weight of custom shaped every decision. Honor was the currency of Viking society. A man's reputation was as important as his wealth, and insults or wrongs could lead to feuds that lasted generations. Yet these conflicts were balanced by the community's need for cohesion, and compromise was often sought through marriage alliances, compensation payments, or sworn oaths. Feasting was another cornerstone of Viking culture. A successful harvest, a victory in battle, or a wedding was marked by days of revelry, with mead flowing freely and tables laden with roasted meats, bread, and cheese. Music and poetry filled the hall, as skalds recited epic verses that honored gods, heroes, and ancestors. These gatherings strengthened bonds within the community and reminded all present that life was not only toil and hardship, but joy and fellowship as well. The role of women in Viking society. To truly understand Viking life, one must understand the role of women. In many medieval societies, women were relegated to the background, but in Norse culture, they held an elevated and respected position. A woman was the keeper of the household, the one who ensured that her family's survival was secure through the harsh cycles of the seasons. The sight of a Viking woman walking with a ring of keys fastened to her belt was a familiar one. Those keys symbolized her authority, granting her control over storerooms, food supplies, and the economic health of the family. If her husband was away at sea or on a raid, it was she who managed the land, the animals, and the workers. She could negotiate, hire help, and handle business transactions in his absence. Marriage in the Viking world was not only a union of two people, but a contract between two families. Dowries were exchanged, not as a purchase, but as a binding agreement that secured alliances and stability. Yet women retained rights within these arrangements. A woman could divorce her husband if he mistreated her, failed to provide for the household, or betrayed the trust of marriage. Such freedoms were unusual for the age, and they revealed the pragmatic nature of Norse society, one built upon survival, where every individual had a role to play. The sagas tell of formidable women who shaped the destiny of their families. Some became famous as shield maidens, taking up arms in times of war, though historians debate how common this was. Others wielded influence through cunning and wisdom, offering counsel to chieftains and kings. Whether myth or history, these stories reflect the respect women commanded within Norse culture, crafts, art, and expression. The Vikings were not only warriors and farmers. They were artists and craftsmen of exceptional skill. Their world was decorated with intricate designs, from the carved wooden beams of their longhouses to the finely wrought jewelry worn by both men and women. Wood was their canvas. From ships to furniture, Norse artisans shaped oak and pine into both practical tools and works of art. Carvings of serpents, dragons, and intertwining knotwork adorned doorframes, weapon handles, and even grave markers. These designs were more than decoration. They carried symbolic meaning, invoking protection, power, and the unseen forces of the spiritual world. Metalwork flourished as well. Blacksmiths forged iron into swords, axes, and spears, but also into farming tools, hinges, and nails. Goldsmiths and silversmiths created brooches, arm rings, and pendants, often in the shapes of animals or gods. Such pieces were both adornments and displays of wealth, signaling status within the community. Textile production was a cornerstone of daily life. Women spun wool into thread, wove it into cloth, and dyed it with natural colors from plants and minerals. The result was clothing that was both durable and vibrant. Linen shirts, woolen cloaks, and finely embroidered dresses were common, with wealthier families flaunting brighter dyes and imported silks. Viking sails themselves were massive textile works, woven from wool and strengthened with fat and resin to withstand the sea's fury. Music and poetry added another layer to their culture. The skalds, or poets, were the memory keepers of Norse society. Through verse, they preserved history, honored gods, and mocked enemies. Their poems were performed aloud, often accompanied by lyres or simple instruments, and their words carried weight, shaping reputations and legacies long after battles were fought. Religion and the sacred. The spiritual life of the Vikings intertwined with their daily existence. They believed themselves to be surrounded by unseen forces, gods, spirits, and ancestors who influenced both fortune and fate. Odin, the All-Father, was revered as the god of wisdom, war, and poetry. Thor, the Thunderer, was protector of mankind, wielding his hammer Mjolnir against giants and chaos. Freya, goddess of fertility and love, was honored for her role in ensuring the prosperity of crops and families. The pantheon of Norse gods reflected the balance of life itself, strength and cunning, love and death, creation and destruction. Sacrifice played a central role in religious life. Offerings of food, weapons, and sometimes even animals were made at sacred groves or burial mounds. These acts honored the gods and sought their favor, ensuring good harvests, safe voyages, or victory in battle. The great festivals, blots, were occasions of both reverence and celebration, where entire communities gathered to feast, drink, and reaffirm their bonds with the divine. Burial practices reveal the deep spiritual beliefs of the Norse. A Viking's grave was not merely a resting place, but a passage into another realm. Warriors might be buried with swords and shields, women with jewelry and household items, farmers with tools of their trade. Ships, too, served as graves, carrying the dead to their next existence. These customs spoke of a worldview where life and death were intertwined, and the afterlife was as real as the world of the living. Law, order, and the thing. Despite their reputation as fierce raiders, the Vikings lived within a structured society governed by law and custom. Central to this order was the thing, the assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes and decide matters of governance. At the thing, laws were recited by memory, for they were not written but spoken traditions passed down through generations. These laws covered everything from inheritance to property disputes, from compensation for injury to rules of trade. Justice was not seen as punishment, but as balance, the restoration of harmony within the community. If a man wronged another, he might be required to pay wergild, a compensation in silver or goods, to settle the matter. If reconciliation was impossible, feuds could erupt, but even then, rules governed the conflict. Violence was not lawless, but bounded by honor and custom. The Thing was also a place of community. Alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and news exchanged. It was here that leaders rose, chosen not only by lineage but by reputation, wealth, and the ability to command loyalty. Democracy in its earliest form breathed through these assemblies, giving the Norse a voice in their own destiny. Seasonal festivals and celebrations. The Viking year was punctuated by festivals that marked the rhythm of life. Each season carried its own rituals, blending survival with celebration. In winter, the Yule festival brought light to the darkest days. Families gathered to feast, drink mead, and honor their ancestors. Fires burned through the night, symbolizing renewal and the promise of spring. The customs of Yule would echo centuries later in modern Christmas traditions, from the burning of the Yule log to the feasting at midwinter. In spring, fertility rites honored the gods and ensured the prosperity of fields and flocks. Summer festivals often coincided with voyages, asking the gods for safe travel and rich trade. Harvest brought gratitude and revelry, a time when communities gave thanks for their survival before the coming winter. These celebrations were more than moments of joy. They reinforced the bonds of kinship and faith that held Viking society together. Each feast, each ritual, reminded them that they were part of a larger cycle, one of life, death, and renewal, echoing the myths of their gods. Global connections of the Norse. The Viking world was not isolated to the fjords and forests of Scandinavia. Their lives were interwoven with distant lands, and their ships carved pathways across seas and rivers that connected them to empires, kingdoms, and marketplaces far beyond their homes. To live in a Viking settlement was to be a part of this expanding web of exchange, knowledge, and culture. To the east, the great rivers of Russia, the Dnieper and the Volga, carried Viking merchants into the heart of the Slavic lands. These Norse traders, known as the Rus, founded settlements such as Novgorod and Kiev, which would grow into powerful states. From there, they traveled southward, eventually reaching the glittering capital of Byzantium, Constantinople. Here, Viking warriors became the famed Varangian Guard, elite protectors of the Byzantine emperors, while merchants filled their holds with silks, spices, and treasures that would astonish those back home. To the west, Norsemen reached Britain, Ireland, and Francia. In these lands, they were both raiders and settlers, leaving behind traces of their presence in place names, language, and culture. Dublin, for example, was founded as a Viking settlement, its streets filled with both trade and conflict. The Isles of Scotland, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man became crossroads where Celtic and Norse cultures blended, shaping identities that endured for centuries. Further still, Viking ships braved the Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. These journeys were not merely raids or conquests, but explorations, driven by the same restlessness that carried traders to foreign ports. The Norse wove their lives into the fabric of a world that spanned continents, making their settlements part of a truly global story. Everyday life, work, and routine. For all their far-flung adventures, most Vikings spent their days in ordinary labor. The rhythm of work was steady, dictated by the needs of the land and sea. At dawn, smoke curled from longhouse chimneys as families rose to begin their tasks. Men might walk to the fields, guiding oxen as they pulled wooden plows across the soil. Others repaired fences, mended nets, or worked at the forge. Women milked cows, churned butter, wove cloth, and prepared meals. Children helped where they could, carrying water, gathering firewood, or watching over younger siblings. Meals reflected the fruits of this labor. Breakfast might consist of porridge made from barley or oats, while supper featured bread, cheese, and stews flavored with leeks and herbs. Meat was a luxury, eaten during feasts or special occasions, though fish was common and often smoked or dried to last through the winter. Ale was the drink of choice, brewed in nearly every household, while mead, honey wine, was reserved for celebrations. Despite the hardship, there was balance. Storytelling, games, and music filled the evenings. Children played with wooden figures and board games like Nefatov, an early form of chess, while adults exchanged tales of gods and ancestors. Life was demanding, but it was never without joy, health, healing, and medicine. Survival in the Viking Age required resilience, and with it came a knowledge of healing and medicine. Viking healers relied on herbs, rituals, and practical remedies to treat illness and injury. Plants such as yarrow, nettle, and garlic were prized for their medicinal properties. Poultices were applied to wounds, teas brewed for fevers, and ointments prepared to ease pain. Honey, known for its antibacterial qualities, was used to clean wounds, while willow bark provided relief from aches, much like aspirin today. But healing was not only practical, it was spiritual. Charms and runes were inscribed to invoke protection, and offerings were made to gods or spirits in the hope of recovery. Disease and misfortune were seen as influenced by both natural and supernatural forces, and so medicine straddled the line between science and faith. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings performed complex surgeries, from setting broken bones to trepanning, cutting into the skull to relieve pressure. Though survival was never guaranteed, these practices reveal a society more advanced in healing than many might assume. Education and knowledge. Formal schools did not exist in Viking society, yet education was ever present. Children learned through observation and practice, absorbing the skills of their parents and elders. A boy learned to wield an axe not from books, but by swinging one beside his father. A girl learned weaving by sitting at her mother's loom, her small fingers mimicking the patterns of thread. Knowledge of runes, the Norse alphabet, was rare but powerful. Runes were carved into wood, stone, and bone, used for inscriptions, charms, and memorials. To know runes was to possess a special kind of wisdom, blending literacy with magic. Oral tradition carried the weight of history and myth. Skalds memorized vast epics, passing them from one generation to the next. These stories preserved the memory of ancestors, the lessons of the gods, and the codes of honor that guided Viking life. In a world without libraries, memory was the greatest archive. The social order. Viking society was layered, structured by status and role, though mobility was possible. At the top were the jarls, the noble class, who held land, wealth, and influence. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people taken in raids or bought through trade, whose labor supported the wealth of their masters. Yet the boundaries between these classes were not fixed. A thrall might earn freedom, a farmer might grow wealthy through trade, and a warrior might win land and renown in battle. Viking society, though hierarchical, offered paths of change for those bold enough to seize them. Honor and reputation mattered more than birth. A poor man who proved himself in battle or trade might rise higher in esteem than a noble who failed in courage. This meritocratic spirit, though limited, allowed ambition and skill to shape destiny in the Viking world. The intimacy of family life. At its core, Viking society revolved around family. Kinship ties stretched across generations, binding individuals to ancestors and descendants alike. Family was protection, identity, and legacy. Marriage was a serious contract, but it was also a bond of affection. Husbands and wives worked side by side, raising children and managing households. Affection is visible in the grave goods left behind. A comb placed near a woman's remains, perhaps carved by her husband. A small toy buried with a child, carved lovingly by a parent. These small objects speak of tenderness within a culture often remembered only for its brutality. Elderly parents remained central to family life, respected as keepers of wisdom and tradition. Grandparents told stories to children by firelight, linking generations through memory. Even in death, family ties endured, as ancestors were honored in rituals and remembered in sagas. Conflict and cooperation between settlements. Though Viking communities were close-knit, they were not free from conflict. Disputes over land, inheritance, or trade could divide families and neighbors. Feuds sometimes erupted into violence, passed down across generations like a curse. But equally important was the drive for cooperation, for survival demanded unity as much as rivalry. Alliances were often sealed with marriage, bringing two families together into one bond. Trade agreements, oaths sworn before gods, and shared feasts helped maintain peace. If violence could not be avoided, it was often ritualized, with honor satisfied through duels or carefully measured vengeance rather than endless chaos. In this way, Viking society balanced the fire of conflict with the necessity of community. Seafaring as a way of life. The sea was not simply a path for raiding or trading. It was the lifeblood of the Viking world. Nearly every settlement lay close to a waterway, for rivers and fjords were the highways of the north. Shipbuilding was an art form. Longships, with their sleek hulls and shallow drafts, could slice through ocean waves and slip silently into shallow rivers. These vessels made possible the global reach of the Vikings, but they also shaped daily life. Fishing boats, ferries, and cargo ships kept communities fed and connected. Children grew up hearing the rhythm of waves against wood, learning to row before they could wield a plow. Sailors read the stars and the flight of birds, trusted the color of water and the feel of wind, and carried in their minds a map of coasts and currents. For the Vikings, seafaring was not a skill. It was a heritage, the Viking sense of beauty. Life was harsh, yet the Vikings sought beauty wherever they could create it. Their combs, carved from bone, were decorated with patterns no one but the owner might see. Their drinking horns bore spirals and beasts. Their brooch shimmered with intricate filigree. Even weapons, instruments of survival and war, were embellished with symbols of strength and faith. Archaeology reveals that grooming and appearance mattered greatly. Combs, tweezers, and ear spoons have been found in graves, suggesting that both men and women took pride in their looks. Hair was often styled, beards trimmed, and clothing dyed with vibrant colors. Far from the stereotype of unkempt savages, the Vikings carried themselves with dignity, their sense of self bound to both honor and presentation. Legacy of the Viking household. Every hearth, every longhouse, was a microcosm of the Viking world. The stories of gods told by firelight, the creak of looms weaving cloth, the smoke of cooking fires rising into rafters. These were the sounds and sights of Norse life. Generations lived beneath one roof, and in those shared spaces, traditions were forged and carried forward. A boy learning to carve wood inherited not just his father's skill, but the patience and pride that defined his people. A girl watching her mother spin wool gained not just a thread for cloth, but the thread of continuity itself. From these households grew the strength of the Viking Age, communities resilient enough to endure winters, bold enough to cross oceans, and wise enough to blend tradition with change. The end of the Viking Age, the continuity of culture. By the end of the Viking Age, around the 11th century, much had changed. Christianity spread through Scandinavia, bringing new rituals, new laws, and new ways of thought. Kings rose, centralizing power and diminishing the independence of local things. Trade routes shifted, and Europe itself transformed. Yet the essence of Viking culture did not vanish. Their craftsmanship, their stories, and their seafaring legacy endured. The settlements they built in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond continued their traditions. Their sagas, recorded centuries later, preserved their worldview, ensuring that the voices of Norse farmers, traders, and families would not be lost to time. The Viking world was never only about conquest. It was about people, men and women, children and elders, who built lives upon soil and sea, who connected villages to empires, who balanced hardship with joy. They were raiders, yes, but they were also fathers and mothers, storytellers and dreamers, bound together in a culture both ordinary and extraordinary. And so when we think of the Vikings, let us not only picture warriors charging from their longships, but also the quiet strength of a woman holding the keys to her household, the laughter of children chasing wooden toys, the farmer sowing seed under a pale northern sun, and the trader unrolling silks from lands half a world away. This was the true Viking world, a tapestry woven from family, trade, and culture, as vital as their swords and sails. If you enjoyed stepping inside the longhouse and walking the marketplaces of the Viking Age, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another journey into history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have thrived in a Viking settlement or longed for adventure across the seas? Thank you for watching, and join us next time as we continue exploring the rich saga of the Vikings and the legacy they left behind.